with malice toward none. Abraham Lincoln asked for exactly that at his second inauguration. But, history had other plans. Less than 100 years later, John F. Kennedy is assassinated in a presidential motorcade. And then, barely a decade after that, Richard Nixon is boarding a helicopter in utter disgrace. It really makes you realize America is just a massive continent of contradictions. If we look at the political history from 1865 up to the year 2000, we're not seeing some smooth, uninterrupted march toward greatness. Actually, it's more like a turbulent, often tragic war that America was essentially fighting with itself. So, welcome to this explainer. I am super excited to guide you through this fascinating historical journey today. Our mission is to impartially trace 135 years of America's dramatic rise, its deep internal fractures, and its relentless evolution. We're literally mapping out the DNA of modern American politics, charting exactly how we got from the smoldering ashes of the Civil War right up to the dawn of the 21st century. Okay, let's dive right into this. Section 1, Reconstruction to the Progressive Era, the Promise and the Compromise. Right after the Civil War, the political promise of equality was basically traded away by the Compromise of 1877. To secure the presidency in a pure political bargain, federal troops were pulled out of the South, and the white establishment instantly took back control. But fast forward to the turn of the century, and we see this massive shift in how the government actually operated. Theodore Roosevelt steps into the presidency in 1901 after an assassination, and he completely rewrites the playbook. He used federal power not just as some administrative tool, but as a direct weapon against concentrated economic power. We're talking busting up massive corporate trusts, forcing rigorous regulations on food and drugs, and conserving millions of acres of public lands. He fundamentally re-engineered what the government meant in the everyday life of an American. And that progressive momentum, it sparked an absolute constitutional acceleration. Suddenly, the income tax is established, the direct election of senators becomes law, prohibition is enacted, and absolutely crucially, women's suffrage is finally achieved in 1920. Think about that for a second. In just 15 short years, the U.S. Constitution changed more than it had in the entire previous century. It was an era of breathless, unstoppable democratic energy. Moving right along to Section 2, Two World Wars and Global Power, the Reluctant Policeman. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how that domestic energy suddenly collided with the global stage. Before 1941, America was largely keeping to itself, a pretty isolationist nation. But December 7, 1941, ended American isolationism permanently. In just 4 years, by 1945, the nation pivoted from avoiding global conflicts to stepping up as the primary architect of an entirely new world order. And the sheer gravity of that new reality is hard to overstate. When the atomic bomb fell in Hiroshima in August 1945, human history changed forever. Overnight, America held a terrifying nuclear monopoly. It basically became a reluctant policeman, forced to place these massive democratic bets on a world that was completely shattered. I mean, they helped found the United Nations, they poured resources into rebuilding a devastated Europe through the Marshall Plan, and they created the NATO alliance. The stakes weren't just political anymore. They were about absolute planetary survival. Which brings us to Section 3, the Cold War, Vietnam, and Watergate, the political fracture. For 45 years, the military-industrial complex and the looming shadow of the Cold War completely defined American politics, the economy, and the culture. But here is where the American consensus truly shatters. 58,000 lives lost. Behind that staggering statistic lies the tragic reality of Vietnam. It fundamentally broke the American political compact. This was a brutal, grinding conflict fought in dense jungles, a war that couldn't be won on the battlefield and definitely couldn't be adequately explained to the young people being drafted to fight it. The result? A profound, deep-seated fracture in public trust. Now, to be fair, Richard Nixon did pull off a geopolitical masterpiece with his diplomatic opening to China. But his resignation in 1974 in utter disgrace over the Watergate scandal, man, that was the final devastating blow to a public faith that was already hanging by a thread. The exact same institutions that Americans relied on to win World War II were suddenly viewed with deep, pervasive suspicion. Let's move forward and see how this builds into Section 4, the Reagan Revolution to Clinton polarization, the end of consensus. By 1980, the political landscape was incredibly ripe for a massive realignment. Ronald Reagan's election ushered in a brand new conservative revolution. It was defined by fierce anti-Soviet rhetoric and supply-side economics, fundamentally declaring that government itself wasn't the solution, it was the problem. And that rhetoric built up to a world-changing climax. In 1989, the Berlin Wall actually falls. By 1991, the Soviet Union completely dissolves. The Cold War was over. It was this moment of unbelievable, euphoric triumph. But paradoxically, it simultaneously stripped American politics of the exact organizing principle that had united the country against a common foe for half a century. Without that shared enemy abroad, the Cold War consensus of the mid-20th century just evaporated, rapidly replaced by really deep internal divisions. We essentially traded a unified global mission for an intense domestic culture war. This internal friction absolutely dominated the 1990s, and it ultimately culminated in the highly partisan impeachment of President Bill Clinton in 1998. The battles weren't being fought across oceans anymore. They were being fought bitterly right across the political aisle. So the crucial point is this number right here, 537. That was the unbelievably thin vote margin in the Florida recount that decided the entire 2000 presidential election. Just think about the irony of that for a second. A nation that had successfully organized the entire free world back in 1945 could barely, in the year 2000, count its own ballots. That number really symbolizes a nation that had become fundamentally and epistemologically divided. We weren't just disagreeing on policy anymore, folks. We were disagreeing on reality itself. Which leads us to our final part. Section 5, Democracy Unfinished, the Open Destiny. Over this incredible 135-year journey we've just traced, this republic somehow survived a bloody civil war, 2 devastating world wars, a Great Depression, the deep fracture of Vietnam, and the sheer institutional betrayal of Watergate. It survived all of those existential threats because the stakes were total, and crucially, the national purpose was shared. But as we stepped into the new millennium, the nation faced a totally unprecedented test. Can the republic survive through disagreement alone? Can a massive, diverse, sprawling country actually govern itself without the shared facts, without the shared enemies, and without that unified purpose that once held it all together? It's a profound question, and one that leaves the destiny of the republic wide open. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time. Today's explainer, From Steel Rails to Silicon Dreams, we're going to explore a really fascinating historical thesis. It's a bold claim, honestly, but the historical data entirely backs it up. Over a span of just over a century, the United States didn't just build the world's largest economy once. No, it built the most powerful economy in human history 3 separate times. It completely reinvented its own foundation with each cycle. So let's dig into exactly how that happened, how the wealth was distributed, and what really drove these massive systemic transformations. Here's the syllabus for our masterclass today. We're going to analyze 4 distinct economic eras. First, the Gilded Age Titans. Second, boom, bust, and depression. Third, building the middle class. And finally, 4, the digital revolution emerges. Let's get to it. All right, part 1, the Gilded Age Titans, focusing on post-Civil War industrialization. Okay, let's dive into this. Think of this era as the heavy, rhythmic heartbeat of a nation that is just waking up. After 1865, America industrialized at a speed that literally shocked the rest of the globe. I mean, by 1900, the US had actually surpassed Britain to become the largest economy on Earth. We are talking about sheer physical output and a completely unprecedented scale here. Andrew Carnegie's steel mills single-handedly supplied the massive rails and beams for a continent under non-stop construction. Then you have John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil controlling a staggering 90% of the nation's oil refining capacity, basically dictating the flow of energy. And hovering above the whole shebang was J.P. Morgan, orchestrating these massive, complex consolidations of the railroads and the banking system. These men weren't just running businesses, they were building immense, physical empires that controlled the very infrastructure of the country. But as you might guess, there was a pretty dark duality to all this explosive growth. The author Mark Twain famously dubbed this era the Gilded Age because, well, it was glittering and beautiful on the surface, but practically rotten underneath. So while Andrew Carnegie was out there funding these magnificent, glittering concert halls and vast public libraries, you literally had 10-year-old children working brutal 14-hour days deep down in coal mines just to help their families survive. And workers who actually tried to organize and demand basic safety conditions or a livable wage, they were routinely beaten, jailed, and occasionally even shot by private militias. The proceeds of capitalism during this time were immense, creating unprecedented national wealth, but it was all highly, highly concentrated at the absolute top of the economic pyramid. Moving right along to Section 2, boom, bust, and depression. This is the wild cycle of the 1920s and 30s. So, swap out the heavy sounds of those steel mills in your head for the upbeat, fast-paced tempo of a jazz piano. The 1920s absolutely roared. Henry Ford's assembly lines made automobiles affordable for an entirely new rising class of consumers, and a massive wave of new goods, radios, refrigerators, washing machines, just poured out of the factories. It really seemed like everyone was getting rich on a soaring stock market. But then, October 29th, 1929, the music abruptly stopped. The stock market crashed spectacularly, and it plunged the nation into a decade of depression. Banks failed by the thousands, practically overnight, wiping out entire lifetimes of savings. And to make matters worse, this financial ruin was combined with the severe ecological devastation of the Dust Bowl. We're talking about literal farms drying up and blowing away in massive, terrifying walls of brown dust. Now, the human toll of this collapse was absolutely staggering: 25%. In 1933, at the absolute lowest point of the Great Depression, 1 in 4 Americans was entirely out of work. To put that into perspective, imagine long, freezing bread lines of gaunt men and threadbare coats literally wrapping around city blocks, just hoping for a single bowl of soup. It was an economic catastrophe of such magnitude that it left the nation completely hollow, fundamentally desperate for a lifeline, and frankly, completely questioning the viability of the capitalist system itself.
So what does this all mean? Well, this level of unprecedented human catastrophe basically forced a complete restructuring of the American economy. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal fundamentally transformed the relationship between the government and its citizens. Out of the ashes of the 1930s came the architecture of modern economic life, the stuff that provides our baseline stability today. Social Security was established to ensure the elderly wouldn't face extreme poverty and starvation in their final years. The SEC was created to regulate the wild, reckless swings of Wall Street to prevent another 1929 crash. And the FDIC was formed to guarantee that your hard-earned bank deposits wouldn't just vanish into thin air, ever again, even if your bank completely went under.
Which brings us to Section 3, Building the Middle Class, the post-war boom from 1945 to 1973. You know, what finally ended the staggering unemployment of the Great Depression wasn't just policy. Actually, it was World War II. Total war mobilization meant the federal government suddenly employed virtually everyone to build the weapons of war. And this brilliantly illustrates the staggering data contrast. We went from that towering 25% unemployment rate in the dark days of 1933 to a post-war era where that number plummeted to historical lows, hovering right around just 3 to 4%. That is a massive shift. And when the troops finally came home in 1945, that incredible economic engine didn't just stop. The massive factories that had been building tanks and bomber planes seamlessly shifted gears, and they started building station wagons and appliances for a newly prosperous public. You see, the American middle class wasn't just some happy accident. It was a very deliberate political and economic creation. You had the GI Bill sending 8 million veterans to college, which completely democratized higher education and created a highly skilled workforce. You had the constant hammering of construction, creating Levittown and 1,000 sprawling suburban communities just like it, totally redefining the American physical landscape. And between 1945 and 1973, America saw the fastest sustained wage growth in human history. This widespread prosperity was actively built. It was built by strong labor unions demanding fair shares of profits, robust government housing and education programs, and frankly, unmatched soaring worker productivity.
All right, let's look at Section 4, the digital revolution emerges, shifting the ground.
But, as we know, history is cyclical, and the post-war boom couldn't last forever. The very ground beneath the American economy began to shift heavily in the 1970s with the arrival of stagflation. Now, stagflation is this brutal, painful combination of stagnant economic growth paired with simultaneously high inflation. The old industrial engine was, well, sputtering out. In response, the 1980s saw President Ronald Reagan launch a massive supply-side revolution. This era brought significant tax cuts for the wealthy, widespread deregulation of financial and corporate industries, and the decisive breaking of the Air Traffic Controllers Union. That last one sent a very clear, chilling message to organized labor everywhere that the rules of the game had fundamentally changed.
Simultaneously, the nation faced massive, sweeping deindustrialization. As manufacturing rapidly moved offshore seeking cheaper labor markets, the once mighty industrial hubs of the Rust Belt really began to decay. Cities like Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Cleveland completely hollowed out as core industries collapsed. And the human cost of this profound transformation, it was immense. Generations of proud industrial workers were basically left standing outside shuttered factory gates, watching their livelihoods dismantle with nowhere to turn for equivalent wages.
So what we were witnessing was an unprecedented economic handover. On one side, we had the weight of steel, those hollowed-out, decaying factories of the Rust Belt representing the agonizing death of massive physical infrastructure. But right alongside it, this new weightless economy was being born. We're talking about young engineers in messy Silicon Valley garages, writing lines of code on whiteboards, creating entirely new worlds from a keyboard. We were watching the absolute death of physical industrial wealth happening right alongside the frantic high-speed birth of intangible digital wealth. It was a complete 180-degree paradigm shift in what value meant in the modern era.
And the pace of this digital dawn was absolutely furious. In the 1970s garage era, upstart companies like Apple, Intel, and Microsoft literally invented a new sector out of thin air, leveraging silicon chips to build personal computing. Fast forward to 1991, the World Wide Web opens to the public, unleashing a level of global connectivity that, honestly, nobody fully understood yet. By the year 2000, we hit the euphoric frenzy of the NASDAQ bubble, where tech stocks incredibly tripled in just 3 years. America was once again the undisputed economic envy of the world, dominating the global market. But this time, the empire was built on lines of code rather than massive blocks of steel.
So, to sum it up, America built the world's most powerful economy not once, but 3 times: industrial, consumer, and digital. This macroeconomic cycle over the past century is absolutely astounding to study. Each era, from the massive blast furnaces of the 1880s to the bustling assembly lines of the 1950s to the buzzing server farms of the 1990s, created unparalleled, enormous wealth for the nation. Yet history shows us through the data that in almost every single iteration, that massive wealth was consistently distributed unequally, creating peaks of immense fortune right alongside valleys of deep financial struggle.
Which brings us to the ultimate question of our masterclass today. Who should benefit from American prosperity? It's the core question that animated the labor struggles of the Gilded Age, the policy shifts of the New Deal, and at the turn of the millennium, it remained a completely unanswered puzzle. Consider the cyclical nature of everything we've analyzed in this explainer: the incredible booms, the devastating busts, the sweeping reinventions of capital and labor. Who ultimately reaps the rewards when the dust settles and the new era begins? Thank you for joining me today, class. Keep pondering that question, and I'll see you next time.
Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. We are jumping straight in today, and I gotta tell you, I'm thrilled to guide you through this, because we're looking at the very architectural blueprints of modern American society. I want you to picture the scene. It's April 9th, 1865. The guns of the Civil War have finally fallen silent at Appomattox. In that quiet, profound moment, 4 million human beings who had lived in bondage were finally free. It was the dawn of a new America. But as we're about to see, freedom is way easier to declare than it is to actually deliver.
There's a quote that goes, "Freedom was declared, equality was not yet born." And honestly, that just hits the nail on the head when it comes to the post-Civil War era. The next 13 years wouldn't just be a list of historical facts, they'd represent this extraordinary, painful, and resilient moral journey. It's the story of a nation constantly trying, failing repeatedly, but trying again to make its founding promise of equality a reality for all its citizens.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really grasp how American social identities changed, we're going to travel through 5 distinct eras: the promise and the betrayal, the Great Northward Migration, redefining the American family, the Second Civil Rights Reconstruction, and finally, building a diverse, modern nation.
So, let's kick things off with Chapter 1, The Promise and the Betrayal. This covers Reconstruction and the Jim Crow backlash.
Right after the Civil War, there was this brief, incredible window of hope. We saw black men voting, holding public office, even serving in Congress. Plus, the Freedmen's Bureau was setting up schools all across the South. It was an amazing flourishing of democracy. But then came the backlash. The Ku Klux Klan used outright terror and murder to dismantle those gains. And once federal troops pulled out of the South in 1877, that window of promise literally slammed shut, trapping so many freed folks in the grinding poverty of sharecropping.
You see, by 1900, this backlash wasn't just random violence. It was heavily systemic. The black vote wasn't just fading, it was methodically wiped out through poll taxes, rigged literacy tests, and outright violence. Everything got segregated: schools, trains, libraries, even cemeteries. What we're talking about here is essentially the social hierarchy of slavery rebuilt under a brand new name: Jim Crow.
Moving on to Chapter 2, The Great Northward Migration.
This was all about moving toward freedom, spanning roughly from 1910 to 1970. 6 million. I mean, just let that staggeringly huge number sink in for a second. 6 million Black Americans packed whatever they could carry into cardboard suitcases, bought train tickets heading north, and literally never looked back. They weren't just chasing better jobs, they were fleeing the very real physical terror of lynching and a legal system completely rigged to hold them in servitude.
This massive demographic shift completely rewired the American identity. Families arrived in major urban centers, think Chicago, Detroit, New York, Los Angeles. They stepped off those trains, got factory jobs, and began the really hard work of building brand new communities from scratch. It changed the cultural DNA of these cities forever.
And wow, did that culture thrive. Enter the Harlem Renaissance. This wasn't just some small local art scene, guys. It was an absolute explosion of Black artistic and intellectual life in the 1920s. Born right out of the energy of the Great Migration, it gave us incredible new forms of jazz, literature, and art that fundamentally and permanently reshaped American culture as a whole.
But, we have to look at the whole picture here. While the North offered factory jobs and vibrant community building, racism wasn't just a Southern thing. It was a national reality. As Black Americans moved north and west, they ran headfirst into redlining, restrictive housing covenants, and devastating race riots. So those northern cities weren't exactly the promised land they'd hoped for.
All right, Section 3, Redefining the American Family. This covers suffrage, war, and second-wave feminism.
The 20th century was this massive push and pull when it came to women's rights in domestic roles. Think about it. After 70 years of fighting, women finally win the right to vote in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. Then, the 1940s bring this huge wave of workforce integration during World War II. But wait, the 1950s hit, and the pendulum swings right back into the domesticity of the baby boom. Ultimately, though, that suburban pressure cooker explodes into second-wave feminism in the 1960s. 16 million. That is how many American men were in uniform during World War II. Because of that massive deployment, women were unexpectedly, basically overnight, pulled into the industrial workforce to keep the country running. It was a total game changer. It proved beyond a doubt that women could excel in roles society had previously sworn they couldn't handle.
But after the war, so many of those same women were pushed right back into the home. Fast forward to 1963, and Betty Friedan writes a book called The Feminine Mystique. She finally put a name to that suffocating trap of 1950s suburban domesticity. And that realization sparked huge demands: equal pay, reproductive rights, and an end to professional discrimination. These became the core pillars of second-wave feminism, completely shaking up the American workplace and home in the 60s and 70s.
Which brings us to Part 4, the Second Civil Rights Reconstruction, the battle for legal equality.
The sheer momentum of this era is just incredible. And it started with everyday citizens. December 1955, Rosa Parks says no to giving up her seat, kicking off the Montgomery bus boycott. From brave folks sitting at segregated lunch counters to people marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma through tear gas, citizens forced the issue. The law eventually had no choice but to catch up, giving us the monumental Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. To really wrap your head around the scale of this movement, picture 250,000 people. That's how many gathered at the Lincoln Memorial in August of 1963. Just imagine that visual, a sea of people stretching all the way down the National Mall. It is the perfect embodiment of America's vast democratic aspirations.
So how did all that activism actually translate into tangible law? It basically happened in two crucial steps. Step 1 was outlawing discrimination across society with the Civil Rights Act. Step 2 was restoring and protecting the ballot with the Voting Rights Act. If you think back to the start of our story, these legislative steps finally, legally, codified the equality that had been promised a full century earlier during the first Reconstruction.
Finally, Section 5, Building a Diverse Modern Nation. The post-1960s demographic mosaic.
You see, the momentum from the 1960s civil rights struggles was absolutely contagious. In 1969, the Stonewall riots launched the modern LGBTQ+ rights movement. Citizens who had been completely marginalized and forced to live in the shadows stood up. They demanded the exact same equal protection and dignity that others were fighting for. Once again, the definition of who was included in the American promise was expanding. Right around that same time, America's relationship with the rest of the world shifted too.
The 1965 Immigration Act was a massive deal. By getting rid of these old, restrictive national origin quotas, this one piece of legislation fundamentally transformed the ethnic makeup of practically every single American city. It opened the doors wide to vibrant new waves of immigrants from Asia, Latin America, and Africa.
And that brings us right to the turn of the millennium. By the year 2000, the United States had officially become the most ethnically diverse large democracy in human history. Now, was it perfect? Definitely not. We still had deep, unhealed wounds and huge ongoing debates. But we'd also traveled further toward our own stated ideals of equality than almost any other country on Earth. The journey from Appomattox in 1865 to the year 2000 wasn't just 135 years passing. It was a total transformation of the American identity.
Which leaves us with one final, super important question. 135 years brought us closer to our founding ideals, but what will the next century demand of us? The story of American civil rights and changing social identities isn't just dusty history. It's a living, breathing, unfinished promise, and we are all the current authors of that story. I hope this explainer helped you map out the incredible architecture of our modern society. Keep questioning, keep learning, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're tracing the dramatic pendulum swing of the American soul, starting from the end of the Civil War right up to the dawn of the new millennium. As a historian looking back, it's absolutely fascinating to watch how a single nation's beliefs evolved so wildly over 135 years. Let's dive right in.
Now, to really understand the deeply divided cultural landscape we live in today, we first have to recognize a fundamental truth about American history. Every generation of Americans has had to decide anew what it believes. You see, American faith isn't just some static set of rules. It's always been this active, fiercely contested cycle. It's essentially a constant tug-of-war between massive institutional growth on one side and a deeply personal, often rebellious search for individual authenticity on the other. It's like every single generation effectively tears down and rebuilds the spiritual framework they inherited from the last.
Looking at this 135-year timeline reveals a really fascinating historical paradox. Notice the progression here, starting from the foundational anchor of the freed Black church in 1865, moving through the intense cultural battles of the 1920s, and ending up with the rise of the knowns, meaning people claiming no religious affiliation, by the year 2000. As we walk through this history together, I want you to pay attention to a very specific pattern. As conservative Christianity became more and more intertwined with political power, the counter-responsive secularism and alternative spirituality grew just as fast. The rise of non-religious Americans, it wasn't a random cultural shift. It was a direct mirror to the growth of evangelical power. Let's start with part 1, the post-war foundation, focusing on the Black church and the social gospel. Right after 1865, the freed Black church emerged as arguably the most consequential religious institution in the entire country. And why is that? Well, because it was literally the only institution fully owned and controlled by Black Americans. It wasn't just a place of worship for a couple of hours on a Sunday, it was a sanctuary in every sense of the word. It provided essential shelter, it built the Freedmen's Bureau schools, and it acted as a massive, powerful political organizing ground. It intertwined this profound spiritual joy with the gritty, daily fight for basic human dignity. It shaped legendary figures from Frederick Douglass to Booker T. Washington, and crucially, it laid the moral and theological groundwork for Martin Luther King Jr. During this same era, what historians call the Third Great Awakening, another foundational concept really took hold, and that was the social gospel. Basically, this was the conviction that faith demanded active social justice, not just personal salvation. The big takeaway here is how practically this was applied. Long before the federal government ever stepped in to create a social safety net, it was church-affiliated institutions driven entirely by the social gospel that built the welfare infrastructure of the modern city. We're talking about settlement houses, the YMCA, the Salvation Army. Faith in America was literally about putting bricks and mortar into building communities. Moving on to part 2, the modernist fracture, centered around the 1925 Scopes trial. Picture this, it's a sweltering July in Dayton, Tennessee, 1925. The trial of high school teacher John Scopes, who was charged with teaching Darwin's theory of evolution, became the absolute cultural clash of the century. On one side, you have scientific naturalism, fiercely defended by the famous lawyer Clarence Darrow. And on the other side, religious literalism, defended by 3-time presidential candidate and evangelical hero William Jennings Bryan. Now, this wasn't just a legal battle over a school curriculum. It blew the lid off a massive cultural fault line between science and fundamentalism. Bryan actually died just 5 days after the trial ended, but fundamentalism? That certainly did not. This exact friction, dramatized in that hot courtroom, would go on to haunt and divide American culture for the rest of the century.
Which brings us to part 3, the evangelical century. We're talking stadiums, screens, and the ballot box. 3 billion. Let that number sink in for a second. That is the estimated number of people Billy Graham preached his message of personal conversion to over 6 decades. 3 billion. He heavily leveraged brand new technologies like television cameras and these massive stadium crusades, including his famous 1957 Madison Square Garden event, to easily become the most influential religious figure of the 20th century. I mean, he was a counselor to literally every U.S. president from Truman to Clinton. This represents a monumental shift for the country. Religion was now a mass media spectacle with truly unprecedented reach. And naturally, this massive media influence rapidly evolved into raw political power. First, you had televangelists like Oral Roberts, Pat Robertson, and Jerry Falwell building these vast media empires. Then, in 1979, Falwell took a massive, decisive step by founding the Moral Majority. This explicitly merged conservative evangelical Christianity with Republican politics, effectively mobilizing this giant audience to help elect Ronald Reagan in 1980. So here is the absolutely crucial point. For the very first time in modern America, being born again had completely transformed. It was no longer just a strictly spiritual or personal identity. It had become a highly organized, deeply influential political voting bloc.
But hey, remember the core thesis of our explainer today. For every massive institutional action, there is a profound counterreaction. Indirect cultural response to this highly institutionalized, politically active, and honestly quite comfortable religion of their parents, the 1960s and 70s sparked a profound spiritual crisis among the youth. They became the original knowns, people claiming zero official religious affiliation. But what were they actually searching for?
Well, they were searching for authenticity outside of the establishment. Millions of young Americans were actively rejecting the rigid, institutionalized structures they grew up with. Instead, they looked elsewhere for genuine individual spiritual experiences. Think about the Beatles' highly publicized pilgrimage to India in 1968. That acted as a massive cultural catalyst. Suddenly, there's this huge influx of Eastern philosophies. Buddhism, Hinduism, and the rise of transcendental meditation absolutely flooded the American spiritual landscape. Make no mistake, this was a clear, direct counter-response to those rigid religious institutions we were just talking about.
But paradoxically, while a ton of people turned east, others actually found their way back to Christianity, but they did it strictly on their own terms. Enter the Jesus movement. We're talking barefoot, long-haired, countercultural believers. They took evangelical faith and totally mixed it with a 1960s aesthetic. They were doing mass baptisms right out in the crashing waves of the Pacific Ocean. They swapped out choirs for contemporary worship music on acoustic guitars, and they held services in casual, stripped-down warehouse spaces. But honestly, here is one of the great ironies of history. This radical, fiercely anti-institutional movement inadvertently planted the exact seeds for the modern, highly corporate megachurch phenomenon that would dominate the end of the century. And that brings us perfectly to part 4, the millennium paradox. Let's look at faith at the century's end. By the year 2000, we are looking at the ultimate dialectic. On one hand, you have an institutional peak. America was the most religiously active large democracy in the developed world. You've got mega churches in places like Texas drawing tens of thousands of worshipers every single Sunday, complete with massive stadium screens and rock bands, while televangelists are raising hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet at that exact same time, we see the rapid rise of the nones. The young, the educated, and the urban were quietly, but very rapidly, leaving organized religion altogether. And our historical analysis today makes the reason crystal clear. The data shows these two groups are permanently linked. The rise of non-religious Americans was a direct, mirrored counter-response to the massive political and institutional growth of evangelicalism. As the institution grew louder and more politically rigid, the search for quiet, individual authenticity sprinted in the exact opposite direction. So, America's historical journey, from the profound spiritual liberation of the freed Black church in 1865, all the way down to the individualized isolation of a modern smartphone meditation app, it didn't resolve the question of belief, it actually deepened it. The growth of secularism wasn't some sudden accident or a collective loss of wonder. It was simply the continuation of that 135-year-old tug of war between the institution and the individual. History leaves us with this defining paradox. The genius of the American experiment allows everyone to believe anything and ensures that some of them will use that freedom to tell everyone else they're wrong. As we wrap up this explainer, looking back at the revivals, the sweaty courtrooms, the packed stadiums, and the California beaches, we're really left to ponder our own modern moment. In a society built entirely on the freedom to endlessly reinvent our own personal truths, can this cultural pendulum ever truly find a center? Or are we just destined to keep swinging? Thanks so much for joining me, and keep asking the deep questions.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a look at the 20th century. But, we aren't looking at it through the usual lenses of military might or economic dominance. Instead, we're looking at the pop machine. Because the reality is, America didn't just participate in the 20th century. Its culture actively built it. Jazz, blues, rock and roll, hip-hop, Hollywood. These things didn't just reflect the times. They actually engineered them.
Okay, let's dive into this. Born from the African-American experience, shaped in America's growing cities, and amplified by American technology, America didn't just make culture, it made the 20th century itself. So, if you really want to understand the modern world, we've got to understand how this machine was built from the ground up. Here is the evolution of the pop machine. We'll be moving chronologically from the jazz era of the 1920s right through to the television age of the 1950s, hitting that cultural peak of 1969 with Woodstock, and then checking out the 1973 birth of hip-hop.
Part 1. The Harlem Renaissance, the sound of the modern world.
6 million. I really want to emphasize the sheer scale of that number. We're talking about the Great Migration. That's 6 million Black Americans moving northward, escaping the very real shadows of Jim Crow. And here's the thing. When they moved, they brought the defining music of the century right along with them to cities like Harlem, Chicago, and Kansas City. And this brilliantly illustrates the voices of that Renaissance. You had Duke Ellington composing with the strict discipline of Bach, but the free-flowing spirit of a poet. You had Louis Armstrong making the trumpets sing with a voice that literally had no precedent. And Bessie Smith just belting out the blues with a raw power that could break hearts across a crowded room. It was this incredible collision of African rhythms, European instruments, and Creole tradition that absolutely conquered the world's ears. But the Harlem Renaissance wasn't just about music. It was a massive explosion of identity. Visionaries like Langston Hughes with his poetry, Zora Neale Hurston with her fiction, and Aaron Douglas with his painting, they used multiple art forms all at once. Fresh from the horrors of slavery and segregation, they were declaring to the world, we are here. We are complex. We are America.
Part 2. Hollywood and mass media, conquering the eyes.
Let's look at the rise of mass media. It's wild to trace this rapid evolution of technology that forged the first truly national culture. Right out of the gate, from the 1890s to the 1930s, cinema becomes the world's dominant art form. You've got Charlie Chaplin making the whole world laugh, and Orson Welles completely redefining what a movie could even be. Then, in the 1920s, radio steps in. FDR's fireside chats are suddenly putting the president directly into American living rooms. And finally, the 1950s hit, television arrives, and it basically swallows everything else whole.
600 million. Let's just slow down for a second and take in the awe of that massive number. On July 20, 1969, 600 million people worldwide gathered around the glowing screens of their televisions to watch human beings walk on the moon. Think about that. It was a deeply human collective wonder beamed directly from space into suburban living rooms. But television didn't just show America its greatest triumphs. Vietnam became the first televised war. And for the first time, a nation actually watched itself lose its own consensus in real time, broadcast right there on the evening news. Mass media wasn't just reflecting the American reality anymore, it was actively making and breaking it. Part 3. Youth Revolution, the Sound of Rebellion. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is seeing how the elements of rock and roll collided to create a total cultural earthquake. In 1955, a truck driver from Tupelo, Mississippi named Elvis Presley walks into Sun Records. The result? Rock and roll. It was born from black rhythm and blues, filtered through white country music, and at its very core, it was a total rejection of parents' rules. So by the time the Beatles arrived in America in 1964, it just set off this musical hysteria that completely merged pop culture with the emerging youth movement. 400,000. That is the monumental scale of Woodstock in August 1969. Just try to imagine 400,000 young people gathered together in a New York field. 3 days of rain, mud, and music. It became the definitive, unshakable symbol of an entire generation at its absolute peak.
Part 4. The birth of hip-hop. From ruins to global dominance.
Check out the raw ingredients of this entirely new culture. We're in the South Bronx, 1973. Right in the middle of burned-out buildings and urban poverty, you had DJs wiring their twin turntables directly into street lampposts just to get power. You had spoken word poetry layered over these heavy beats. You had young people breakdancing on flattened cardboard boxes. Hip-hop literally invented itself from the rage and ruins of an abandoned city, turning survival itself into this electric, global creative force.
Part 5. The Culture Wars. The Paradox of the 90s.
So, the crucial point is that by the 1990s, American culture had deeply fractured. We started seeing fierce battles over identity and values. Questions were being asked everywhere. Whose art actually deserves public funding? Whose sexuality is allowed to be visible on television? Whose history gets taught in schools? America was fiercely debating its own definitions and doing it without any single orthodoxy telling everyone what they had to think.
And right here we see the central paradox of that era: internal division versus external dominance. On one hand, you have these intense domestic culture wars and fractured national politics at home. But on the other, there's this relentless global expansion. We're talking McDonald's opening in Beijing, MTV playing in Jakarta. A culture that was so internally divided at home somehow became the most powerful external export machine the world had ever seen.
Part 6. The millennium. Standing at the threshold.
1 million. The date is December 31st, 1999. Picture 1 million people crowded into Times Square at midnight. The much-feared Y2K computer bugs didn't happen. The lights stayed on. Confetti is exploding in waves, the illuminated ball is descending, and the crowd just breathes this massive collective sigh of relief as America stepped across the threshold into the 21st century.
Let's move to and see how this builds into an overarching legacy. What did the American century actually achieve? Well, it took the music of its most oppressed people and gave it to the world as the very sound of modernity. It invented the moving image and used it to project both profound truths and incredible fantasies. It created a planetary youth culture that didn't just stay in America, it went everywhere. It was, at its heart, a highly contradictory civilization glowing brilliantly under its own luminous grid.
But we end on this big question: who gets to be American? Because for all of its massive cultural exports, the nation had not yet resolved the fundamental questions about race, about equality, and about power that had defined it since the 1860s. Those questions traveled, completely unresolved, right into the new century. And figuring out how those exact same questions shape the movies, music, and media you consume today, well, that's something for you to think about long after this explainer ends.
Hey everyone, welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really bold premise from our source material: the idea that the 20th century was, well, fundamentally defined by American culture. We're going to trace this absolutely breathtaking arc, starting right at the roots with an explosion of domestic art forms, jazz, rock and roll, hip-hop, and see how they literally rewired the entire globe.
Okay, let's dive into this. Our sources make a massive claim. America didn't just make culture, it made the 20th century itself. And what's so fascinating here is the paradox right at the heart of this whole thing. The art forms that became the universal language for modernity, they didn't start in some sleek global corporate boardroom. No way. They were deeply domestic, born primarily from the unique and often really painful African-American experiences right here at home. But somehow, these raw, highly localized sounds became the exact vocabulary the whole world used to express what it meant to be modern.
So, Section 1. The birth of modern sound, from the Great Migration to the global stage.
6 million. To put that into perspective, that's the staggering number of Black Americans who moved out of the rural South and traveled northward during the Great Migration. And as they moved, they didn't just bring their families. They brought the raw materials, the soul, and the distinct rhythms that would literally build modern music from the ground up.
So how exactly did those raw materials come together? Well, it was a totally unique recipe. First, you've got the foundational African rhythms. Then, you mix those with European instruments. Think the trumpet, the piano. And third, you fold in that rich Creole tradition. All three of these incredibly unique domestic ingredients synthesized right in the streets of New Orleans. And from there, this incredible new sound just exploded.
It traveled up the Mississippi River, conquered cities like Chicago, made its way over to Harlem, and eventually it captured the imagination of the entire world. By the 1920s, all this energy erupted into the Harlem Renaissance. We're talking about a multifaceted explosion of black arts. I mean, you had Duke Ellington composing with just absolute discipline and grace. You had Louis Armstrong doing things with a trumpet that literally had no precedent. Bessie Smith belting out the blues with this room-shaking power. Langston Hughes revolutionizing poetry, and Zora Neale Hurston totally redefining fiction. It was rhythmic, it was punchy, and honestly, it was completely unstoppable. The message was clear. We are here. We are complex. We are America. This was the incredibly powerful, simultaneous declaration being made across every single art form by Black Americans. Fresh from the deeply traumatic eras of slavery and Jim Crow, they were asserting their identity, and in doing so, they were actually creating the cultural bedrock of the entire nation.
Moving on to Section 2, Media Makes a Nation. Accelerating the culture.
As we move through the decades, it's wild to see how the medium actively dictated the message. Back in the 1890s, silent films and Nickelodeons allowed someone like Charlie Chaplin to make the whole globe laugh without uttering a single word. Fast forward to the 1920s, and radio creates a truly shared national experience. Suddenly, you have FDR's fireside chats beaming directly into American living rooms. Then the 1950s brought us television, which changed our visual landscape forever, leading right up to 1969 when satellite broadcasts connected the entire planet in real time.
Now consider this. Television didn't just show America, it made America. When TV arrived on the scene in the 1950s, it swallowed every other medium whole. It wasn't just holding up a mirror to what people were doing. It was actively creating a truly national mass consumerism. It was telling people what to buy, how to dress, and ultimately, what to care about. 600 million. Just let that sink in for a second. That is how many people worldwide sat in front of a glowing box in 1969 to watch the Apollo 11 moon landing. It's awe-inspiring, really. You have this massive global audience completely unified in a single televised moment of human achievement. But here's the catch. This exact same technology was doing two very different things at the exact same time. On the one hand, television was unifying the globe in wonder with that 1969 moon landing, but on the other hand, it was simultaneously showing the Vietnam War playing out in living rooms every single night. It was the very first time a nation watched itself lose its own consensus in real time. The same box bringing everyone together was actively reflecting our deepest fractures.
Which brings us to Section 3, the Global Youth Revolution. A new generation rejects the rules. Let's break down the genesis of rock and roll. It started with black rhythm and blues, it got filtered through white country music, and then it was just totally ignited by sheer youth rebellion. Sparked by figures like a young truck driver named Elvis Presley back in 1955, this synthesis created the literal sound of a young America breaking free from its parents' rules. It was loud, it was brand new, and it belonged entirely to the youth.
And this brilliantly illustrates how the rebellion rapidly found its global icons. By 1964, the Beatles arrived in America, setting off a wave of hysteria that completely merged pop culture with a massive youth movement. This whole cultural wave crested in 1969 with Woodstock, an event that, without a doubt, defined a generation. It wasn't just about the music anymore, you know? It was an entirely new way of looking at the world. To really grasp the sheer scale of this movement, look at this number. 400,000. That's the estimated number of young people who gathered in a field in upstate New York for 3 days of rain, mud, and music at Woodstock. It was basically a physical manifestation of a generation reaching its absolute zenith.
All right, let's jump to Section 4, Hip-Hop and Urban Resilience. Born from the Abandoned City.
Now let's zoom right back into the micro level. Hip-hop was born in the South Bronx in 1973. And this wasn't cooked up in some high-tech studio. It was forged outside, from 2 turntables, spoken word, and the very real, palpable rage of an impoverished, abandoned city neighborhood. These young people were quite literally creating an entirely new culture from the ruins around them. Fast forward a bit, and by the 1990s, this localized art form of resilience became America's most commercially dominant culture globally. The pipeline here is just incredible when you think about it. Something born in the forgotten streets of the South Bronx became the beating heart of global commercial culture. It became the universal language for modernity, a language that youth across the planet started using to express their own localized struggles.
Okay,
Section 5, the ultimate export machine, the paradox of American dominance.
This right here is where we see the defining contradiction of the American century. On one hand, you have a nation that is deeply fractured internally by intense culture wars, arguing over public arts funding, visible sexuality on television, and even whose version of history gets taught in schools. Yet, externally, we see total dominance. While Americans were arguing at home, McDonald's was busy opening up in Beijing and MTV was playing on TVs in Jakarta. American pop culture was conquering the globe.
So, the crucial point is, why did this happen? The core reason foreign nations so eagerly adopted American consumer habits basically boils down to one thing. There was no single orthodoxy to enforce. Precisely because America was so contradictory, so noisy, and so divided, its culture didn't feel like state-sponsored propaganda. It was universally adaptable. People all over the world could take pieces of American culture, the genes, the music, the movies, and easily make them their own.
Which brings us right to the threshold of the millennium. Summarizing this epic journey from 1865 to the year 2000, just picture that million-person crowd in Times Square on New Year's Eve 1999, everyone holding their breath. America had taken the music of its most oppressed people and given it to the world. It had essentially invented the youth culture of the entire planet. It stood as the most creative yet wildly contradictory civilization on Earth.
And that leaves us with a final, really provocative thought. How exactly does a civilization conquer the globe with its culture, its music, and its media, while leaving its own foundational questions of race, equality, and power entirely unresolved? Because, as we know, these deeply American questions didn't just magically disappear at midnight in 1999. They traveled unresolved right into the 21st century. And that is something truly worth thinking about. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope this structured look at our cultural history has been as fascinating for you as it was for me. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.